Won't you open your Bibles to John chapter 11? John chapter 11. And we're going to read from verse 45 to the end of the chapter. Alright, John chapter 11, verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." He did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another, as they stood in the temple, "What do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know, so that they might arrest him. So far in God's word. So in John chapter 11, we've just come at the end of one of the biggest miracles that Jesus performs, one of the biggest signs that he gives to who he is. He raises Lazarus from the dead. He calls to him, "Lazarus, come out," and he comes out. An incredible miracle, an incredible thing to have happened. Death itself reversed, and a man who had been dead for 4 days has come back. And we've dealt with a lot of issues throughout the text. In fact, the last few weeks, and Warren's sermon last week included, we've been looking at what can be counted as very difficult issues. The problem of evil, the problem of suffering. Now, where is God when things hurt? Does God use evil and good? And the answer to all those things is often not what we quite expect. We learned from our previous text that, well, where is God in our suffering? He is right there with us. He is the Jesus Christ who weeps, who empathizes, who knows what it is to walk in our shoes and to suffer alongside. But he's also the God who lets us suffer, who sends suffering our way. We saw that when Jesus waited. He allowed Lazarus to die so that his glory might be shown. And so these questions have been bouncing back and forth, and they're difficult for us to deal with, because they're not just hypotheticals to us. They're not just theory. They're really practical, because we suffer. We go through dark times. We go through deep valleys. We will be bereaved of our loved ones. And we ourselves will get sick and old, suffer persecution, and wither. And so these questions become very real to us. And that's all the answers that the Bible gives us. The way the scriptures put it to us is always presenting to us a Jesus Christ that we can trust. And today we're going to underscore that by looking again at really the heart of the matter. How are we to understand the sovereignty of God and suffering? How do we put them together? And the answer always comes when we think of the death of Jesus Christ himself. Our text here, it seems a little bit sort of mundane compared to the text we just came from, the resurrection of Lazarus, but it shows us an important truth. You see, the Pharisees and then they have this conversation. They don't know what to do about Jesus. And they eventually decide to put him to death. But the secret of our text is that though they decide to do it, they are determined to find a way to kill Jesus. That was God's plan all along. And there is a mystery in how the two work, but probably the best verse that hints at it is Acts 2, verse 22 to 23. Peter stands up on the day of Pentecost and he preaches a sermon, and these are the words he says: "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." And I'm going to do something that preachers sometimes do. I'm going to use the framework of that text, that Acts 2 text, as the outline for how we're going to deal with the text we read in John. This Jesus, a man attested by many signs, was delivered up by the foreknowledge, the predestined plan of God. But you took him and killed him by the hands of lawless men. The signs are evident. The Pharisees have seen them. They've all seen them. That's why their first question when they hear about Lazarus again is, what are we to do? They're basically asking, what are we going to do about this? Or we've come up with nothing to deal with this man. At every turn, at every argument we bring, he confounds us. We cannot disprove his miracles. So what are we to do? They have been subjected to futility, uselessness, because at every attempt to try to disprove who Jesus is, at every attempt to try to undermine him, he has emerged victorious. Now, you'd think maybe this would be a good time for some introspection from the Pharisees' part. Everything they've done hasn't worked. Not only that, he's continuing to do miracle after miracle, sign after sign, each one sort of bigger than the last, and now even the dead themselves obey his voice. Surely there's a point where you reconsider this person, right? Instead of what are we to do, they should be saying, guys, maybe this guy is telling the truth. Maybe this Jesus Christ, well, maybe he is the Christ. Sorry, I said Christ as though it was his surname, but it wasn't. I hope you know that. Christ is a title, not a surname. And we get that wrong sometimes, like me, just now. Jesus is the Christ. Maybe he is the Messiah. Maybe he is the anointed one who's supposed to come. But the thought doesn't even cross their minds. In fact, you see very quickly what their worry is. Their worry isn't that he might be the Messiah. They're pretty determined and set in their hearts that he's not. They decided that long ago. The God of this world has blinded their eyes that Jesus could do any number of miracles before them, and they would never believe. Because they are determined in their blindness to hold on to their own power. Do you see what their worry is, the Pharisees, in verse 47 and verse 48? If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. They're just worried about the Romans. And not just about the Romans, they're worried about themselves. If we let this man continue to do these things and the people start to go after him, well, maybe the Romans will come and crush him and us and the nation, and then where will we be? The Pharisees have become so accustomed to their position of power that they don't want to lose it. And instead of trusting in the sovereignty of God, submitting in obedience and faithfulness to what he is doing and who he is, they have chosen to trust in themselves and political systems. You see that there's a very political agenda here. They have power and they want to keep it. They see the Romans as a way of coming to take it away. They see Jesus as a way of doing that, and they'll oppose anybody who affects their position. In truth, Israel, the nation itself, is a secondary concern. They're worried about themselves. And that is why Jesus opposes them. Jesus always opposes the proud. those who cling to themselves, those who want position for themselves, those who want to elevate themselves above others, Jesus always opposes. And these men are no different. They will not see Jesus because the God of their hearts is themselves. And they will cling to that with everything they have. And in that way, they're futile, they're useless. They cannot see past their own ambition, and so they don't know what to do anymore. What are we to do with this man? We have come up with nothing. Just an aside, just very quickly. There's always two ways to be deceived, the scriptures tell us. The one is like the Pharisees, right? That Jesus could perform any sign in front of them. God could do anything, and they just would not see. They are so clinging to their hearts, and they're open to nothing. Neither to the Spirit, neither to His work, neither to even the thought that Jesus Christ is God. And the second way is the direct opposite. It is those who are open to everything, who have no discernment. That everything that happens sincerely, or everything that seems supernatural, or anything that appears to be a sign, they will follow to their own detriment. The Bible tells us to know the Word of God, to be obedient and faithful, and by that we can recognize what is from God and what isn't. There is no use being so closed off you cannot see God working, and there's no use being so open that you can differentiate neither between Satan or God or anything in between. The Pharisees are guilty of one, and a lot of the other people that we've seen in the scriptures, especially early in the Gospel of John, have been guilty of the other. Following just for food's sake, for the sake of miracles. When miracles, like we've already talked about, are signs. They are big, glowing signs, all with the message, Jesus is God. Believe in Him. That many people stop at the sign and enjoy the sign instead of going to whom the sign points to. These Pharisees, they can't even see the sign. If we let him go on like this, they say, if we just let him continue to do good, continue to raise the dead, continue to heal, continue to do his miracles and serve the people and point them to God, well, it's going to affect us badly. And so they will do anything to stop it. And there's a bit of irony in this text. I hope you see, in fact, it's a mark of John's writing, and we're going to see it a lot as we get towards the crucifixion, especially at the crucifixion, that John has a marked irony. He likes to take statements that others are using, and though they are very true in their essence, the people saying them do not understand their truth. And this is a perfect example. The first part is here, the Jews are worried, the Pharisees are worried that the Romans are going to come and destroy them because of Jesus Christ. You know what the irony of that statement is? The Jews eventually are going to be destroyed. In AD 70, the Romans are going to come and wipe them out. Destroy Jerusalem so that not one brick stands upon another. And do you know why that happens? Not because they trusted in Jesus, but because they rejected him and they trusted in political power instead of the power of God. They weren't obedient, they weren't faithful, they did not cling to God or to Christ. They abandoned him. They trusted in their might and their political whatever ideologies. And the irony of it in the end is that is what destroys them. The second bout of irony comes out of the mouth of Caiaphas. Caiaphas, we know, is high priest for about 18 years, probably from the year, AD 16 to around about AD 36, 37, 38, somewhere around there. And he is a political appointment. The high priest had become a position like that. That instead of being elected amongst the people for the honor and glory of God, the high priest had become almost of a joke of a position. Because they were appointed by Herod or by the Romans or by someone who would help them keep power. And so Caiaphas, sitting here in this meeting, he says something that is true. But he doesn't mean it in the way that God means it. He looks at the situation with Jesus. He looks at the Pharisees who are so confounded, and he says to them, you know nothing at all. You don't even understand the situation. You're useless. You're futile. You can't even know what to do because you're chasing your own tail. There's only one way to deal with this. The only way to deal with someone like Jesus Christ, and he puts it in a nice way, it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish. He's saying, rather than the nation dying and we lose our power, what is better for us is that he died. He's using sacrificial language there, but not the same way that we will understand it in a few seconds. The sacrificial language he's using is that of the scapegoat. You know, it's part of the Jewish idea that there would be a goat that they'd symbolically put all the sins on and they'd send them off into the wilderness. The scapegoat, right? And we use the same term today for someone who takes the blame for something. And that's exactly what Jesus is going to be, their scapegoat. All of their problems, all of their ills, all of the things that are wrong, they're going to pile upon Jesus Christ, and they're going to kill him. And that'll solve all of their problems. It's better that way, surely. Rather let this one person die than all of us suffer. It is better for us that he died. They do not care anything for Jesus Christ. They're determined to kill him. That's exactly what our Acts 2 verse says. This Jesus Christ, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. You don't see any coercion here, do you? No, that they decide this themselves. We know that it's pride that consumes their hearts, not wanting to fulfill the word of God. We know that even in this prophetic statement that Caiaphas makes, he doesn't make it knowing that he's even prophesying. He makes it because when he thinks of Jesus, he is consumed with hate. He is consumed with envy and pride, and he will kill him at all costs. This is what the crucifixion always presents to us. It's this strange paradox, because in it we have the worst of humankind displayed. We have the most evil intentions of men, and we are all involved in it in some way, because our sin is at play here. The phrase I often like to use, because it's shocking and it's exactly what our sin demands, is that we kill God because it's what we've always wanted to do. That is what our sin has always demanded. From the first time we sin, from the first time we harbor rebellion in our hearts, we have said to God that our rule will trump yours. That if you will not bow down to us, well, then we will do away with you. Because we do not want a God over our lives. That is what sin is. Sin is the usurping of power. And finally, when we could get hold of God, when he came down amongst us, well, we showed him what we always thought of him. We took him and we killed him. Do you see the Pharisees that make this plan? And these are supposed to be godly men. These are supposed to be men who know the scriptures. These are supposed to be men who uphold the principles of God. And their only recourse and their only action is, well, we must kill him. They will trump up charges. They will have false trials. They will bring false witnesses. They'll hand him over to the Romans, who will beat him and mock him and crucify him. The most evil, vindictive thing humanity has ever done. The killing of the only innocent who has ever lived. The very Son of God who walked among us. That is the wickedness and cruelty of men. But it is also the plan of God. though these men plan his death, God means it for good. But that's the story of Joseph, remember? That's where we have that wonderful verse in Genesis chapter 50. That after everything Joseph goes through, after being sold into slavery, after being falsely accused of adultery, after languishing in prison for many years, and after eventually arising to second in charge of Egypt, he's confronted again with his brothers, the ones who inflicted all this upon him. And when they're so afraid that Joseph is going to kill him, he says that to them. He looks at them and he says, "You meant it for evil." Because they did. They didn't throw Joseph in the pit because they're like, I'm sure the Lord's going to use this. They're like, guys, I feel this is the will of God, that we should throw him in this pit and fake his death and then tell our dad he's dead and then feel really guilty for a few years about it. Of course not. They meant it for evil. They sold him into slavery. In fact, before that, they actually just wanted to kill him. There's no part of their hearts that ever wanted good to come out of it. But God meant it for good. That means it was always God's will that happened to Joseph. And we see the end, right from the beginning. We see at the end the good that comes from it. Joseph not only saves his family, but many, many people and nations. But we often don't see that from the beginning, do we? And that is why the cross is the greatest example of this. These Pharisees, these evil men, our sin and our wickedness conspire to kill Jesus. We mean it for evil, but God means it for good. That's why in verse 51, he did not say this of his own accord, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God. That's how we understand the cross, right? Because we know that now. We know that we look at the cross, and that's why we can have it as our symbol, right? And that's a symbol, by the way. If I ever see anybody kneeling before that cross, I'm going to slap them. Because it's a symbol. We're not idolaters. We have it as our symbol because we don't remember, or we do remember the cruelty or the sin of our hearts, but we also remember the deep love of God, the incredible, magnificent mercy of Christ. Because that is why God sent him. We're getting towards Christmas time, and I'm sure I'm going to preach, one of my 4 different Christmas sermons that I have. We'll see which one's in rotation this year. There's only so much you can preach at Christmas when you've been preaching like every year for like 10 years. But that's what it means, right? That's what we finally begin to understand, that baby in the manger, that baby lying there weak and helpless, that baby who will one day be king, he takes on this flesh, he takes on our blood, he takes on all of these things so that he can be killed. God becomes us so that he can be forcibly taken against his will and crucified. And the true wonder of it is it's never ever against his will. It was always his plan. That is why it says the high priest is actually prophesied and he doesn't know it. The irony of his statement is it's true. One man will die for the nation. Just not in the way they think. He will not die to save them from the Romans. He will not die to save them from some political enemy. He will die to gather to himself those who are his, to save them from their sins, to bring them to God, and to give them everlasting life forever. That is why he will die. And he does it to save his people. They mean it for evil. God means it for good. Now, the way I'm looking at this is a little different than maybe Warren looked at it last week, with the problem of good and evil. And it is a theological issue that we struggle with, and I'm sure it's something we can meditate on further. But the answer for us is always in the cross. We might not understand all the machinations of this world, but we do know that even our sin, even the most wicked deeds we could possibly commit, because as the cross shows us, we can mean them for evil in the most evil of ways. And God means it for good, and how He will turn them on themselves for His glory. Because that's what He does in the cross. Jesus Christ, in His humility, He is delivered up by God. Our Acts 2 verse tells us by the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. And this is so important for understand, because sometimes when we think of God's plan, we think of it as having like a plan B or different stages of how it is. God has always had one plan. And we have never been able to derail it. Not when Adam and Eve sinned, not when Jesus Christ came. This is how it was always supposed to go. Jesus Christ is always supposed to come because it's the definite plan. The foreknowledge of God there is a reference to the fact that before everything existed, Jesus Christ was known. And this is always going to happen. He was always going to come. He was always going to save us. So everything that has happened from the beginning of time to that point had to happen exactly the way it happened, so that Jesus Christ would come and die for our sins. This is how all things work together. Jesus knows this. That's why, as we sort of get towards the end of this passage, the Passover is coming. And they begin to look, well, is Jesus going to come or isn't He? And He is, of course, coming. He is the Passover lamb. He's preparing Himself for this. And after this chapter, we're gonna begin to enter into the last sort of 2 weeks of Jesus' life, as He makes His way towards that climactic day. Because He knows what they're planning. He knows that they have sat together and they have thought to kill Him. They are determined to arrest Him and put Him to death. And He does not flee. He doesn't run away and hide. No, He goes to the wilderness to carry on preaching for a bit, and then He makes His way towards Jerusalem again. Because He knows that that is where He must be. His humility, His beauty, His wonder is to fulfill the plan and desires of God. And so He walks freely and openly towards His own death, knowing by whom it will come and by what they do. The cross is always that thing that helps us to understand God. We don't always understand the intricate parts, because God is still God. His ways are not our ways. He is so far above us that even for us to understand small things about Him hurts our mind. But we understand that the cross is a place where the evilness of humanity and the mercy of God meet. And the mercy of God always wins. The grace of God always prevails. The love of God cannot be thwarted. It will always succeed. That though they drive cruel nails into His hand, though they whip Him and beat Him, though we do all we can to derail His plan, to put ourselves on top, to revel in our sin and wallow in it for all eternity, Jesus Christ swallows it all and in turn gives us grace. The most evil thing humanity could ever do is the greatest thing that God has ever accomplished. The cross of Jesus Christ. That doesn't mean that these people who are plotting here are not responsible. Of course they are. Like I told you, where do you see any coercion in these chapters? They made these decisions themselves. They're blind. Their sin has consumed them. They want to kill God, but God will even use their sin for His glory, as He will do with ours in all ways. So what I want you to do with passages like this, what I want you to understand and to hold, and especially that passage in Acts 2, is a deep understanding that whatever we go through, and I'm not just talking our suffering now, that that's included. We will suffer, and we've dealt with that a lot in this chapter, and we will face evil things, and we will face much persecution. I was just reminded of that this week. I'm sure you guys heard about that guy who was killed by native Indians. You guys heard about him? He was shot with an arrow because he was, trying to evangelize to them. And you know how I heard about it? I didn't hear about it because I saw it on the news. I heard about it because I saw people mocking him. Like pages and pages of people just mocking this guy, saying like he deserved what he got, Darwin Award of the Year. You know, what an idiot. Because these people are secluded people. I think they've been secluded for hundreds of years, and for the last 20 years, no one has been allowed to contact them. And so this guy decided he was going to try to share the gospel with them, and they shot him with an arrow. And to my knowledge, they still haven't recovered his body. And I've just seen the mockery that's come from this, and I've just realized again the severe misunderstanding the world will always have when it comes to Christ and his people. They'll always look at something like that and they'll think, what an idiot. What a waste of his life. What a fool. What a joker. And I know nothing much about him. He was doing his best to be obedient and faithful in the way he understood. And a death like that is never pointless. Because that's what our scriptures teach us. Because nothing is pointless. Even through our sin, even through our suffering, even through our deaths, even through the worst of what this world could throw at us, God is at work. That story this week reminded me of Jim Elliot's story. You guys know Jim Elliot and the guys who went to visit sounds like they were just going for tea. No, they went to convert I forget the name of the tribe. And they also were killed. Young men with families and children killed, and they found their bodies floating down the river. And at the same time that story came out, the newspapers and that all called it a waste of life. Because here were a few men who had such potential, who were smart young men with families and lives before them, who wasted their lives trying to reach a people they knew were dangerous. And you know what? It's never a waste. It's never pointless. In fact, the wonderful fruit of Jim Elliot and his friends is that whole tribe is converted. Nothing is pointless. Everything rests in the sovereignty of God. And that is such a great comfort to us, because when we sin, even our sin cannot derail that plan. That when we suffer, we know that we are sitting squarely where he wants us to be. Our thoughts should be to be obedient and faithful, no matter what comes our way. And to remember the cross. To always cling to Jesus Christ. Because in him we have our love, our grace, our peace, and our understanding. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you again for this time we could spend together. We thank you that we can just marvel at your Son, Lord. Marvel at your plan. Marvel at how you use all things to glorify your name, Lord, in a way that boggles our minds. That even in the wickedness, the depraved hearts of evil, wicked people, Lord, you are at work for your own glory's sake. And so we trust in you, Lord. We cling to your Son, to his cross, Lord, to what he has accomplished. That our sin is overcome. That grace has been shown. And that through him we can have eternal life. Help us to grasp these things. Help us to understand them, Lord, in all things. Honor and glorify your name. Amen.